Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to a new episode of our Letter to Vox podcast.
Today, we are undertaking a deep dive into, well, one of the 20th century's most essential and I'd argue most misunderstood philosophical minds, Albert Camus.
That's right. And for those of you looking for a real key to understanding that crisis of meaning that really defined the mid-century, this is it. We've gathered some extensive sources detailing his unique life, a life rooted in the frankly, brutal realities of French Algeria, his foundational philosophical concepts, especially that electrifying idea of the absurd, and we'll use the startling literary lens of his masterpiece, The Stranger, or L'étranger, to see those concepts really in action.
And our mission today is, I think, a crucial one. We have to synthesize Albert Camus' intensely personal experience, the grinding poverty, the constant health struggles, the direct experience of colonialism with his intellectual output.
Right.
His work isn't just dry philosophy. It's an urgent call for human revolt and solidarity that was forged in the fires of, well, real-world suffering.
We're going to focus heavily on how his novels serve as these visceral test cases for his abstract arguments, and we'll try to settle, once and for all, why he so passionately rejected the label of existentialist for his work.
He insisted his philosophy stood completely opposed to theirs on a fundamental point.
Exactly. So let's unpack the life that created the philosophy.
To understand Albert Camus, you absolutely have to start in French Algeria. That's the place that made him. He was born on November 7, 1913, in Mondovi, a town then part of French North Africa, now known as Dréant in modern-day Algeria.
And this colonial environment, it wasn't just a backdrop, was it?
Not at all. It was the absolute foundation of his lifelong commitment to justice.
His background was this blend of cultures, French on his father's side, Spanish on his mother's. It was defined almost immediately by tragedy and just intense poverty.
An almost unbelievable tragedy. His father, Lucien Camus, was an unskilled carter. And within a year of Albert Camus's birth, his father was mobilized for World War I, and he died in the Battle of the Marne in 1914.
So Camus grew up almost entirely without a father figure.
And that immediate shift just plunged the family deeper into hardship. His mother and his older brother, they moved to the impoverished Belcourt district in Algiers. They lived in this tiny, crowded apartment under the very strict and often silent guidance of the grandmother.
And his mother was, what, illiterate?
She was illiterate and struggled with speech and hearing difficulties. She took on just backbreaking labor as a factory worker and a cleaning lady to survive.
This experience of working-class poverty, and specifically in a colonial structure, it just had to have marked him indelibly.
Absolutely. And yet, he had this rare intellectual gift. In 1924, his primary school teacher saw his potential, and he championed him, helped him prepare for the gymnasium entrance exam.
Which was a genuine escape route, but it sounds like it came with a pretty heavy emotional cost.
A huge cost. Entering the bourgeois world of French education created this intense internal fracture for him. He felt this profound shame about his mother and his working-class roots in front of his more affluent classmates.
He was living in two completely different worlds.
Exactly. The silent, impoverished reality of his home, and then the intellectual, sophisticated promise of the gymnasium.
And the sources suggest he was actively looking for ways to sort of establish himself outside of just being the smart poor kid, to bridge that class divide.
He did. He channeled his energy into physical activity. He became an excellent sportsman, specifically a goalkeeper for the Racing Universitaire d'Alger football club. It was a way to belong,
Yeah, a testament to raw ability that money or your background can't really touch.
But this physical dynamism was, well, it was soon countered by a devastating physical reality. In 1930, at just 17, Albert Camus contracted tuberculosis.
Which at that time was basically a death sentence for many.
A death sentence. It violently interrupted his education, and it forced him into months of isolation and recuperation in a sanatorium in southern France.
That brush with mortality, that sudden awareness of how fragile the body is and just the randomness of disease. You can't overstate how much that must have formed his later philosophy.
Oh, absolutely. The sense of the body betraying the mind, the randomness of fate, it really informs that fundamental contradiction he later defined as the absurd.
Despite the setback, he pressed on. He started philosophy studies at the University of Algiers, and he established a really crucial intellectual relationship with Professor Jean Grenier.
And this is where the philosophy truly starts to coalesce, but it's rooted firmly in those harsh lessons of his early life. Poverty taught him injustice, and TB taught him the indifference of existence.
So his early adult life was just as volatile, both personally and politically. In 1934, he gets into this. Well, sounds like a pretty turbulent marriage with Simone.
Yes, she was from the French Algerian upper class, and it was a very unstable union. The marriage deteriorated rapidly, and it was complicated by Simone's morphine addiction and a lifestyle that our sources describe as promiscuous.
But what's notable is that even after they separated, Camus kept this sense of responsibility, right?
Yeah. He did. He supported her financially until the end of her life, which suggests a deep, if very complicated sense of commitment, even though the relationship itself had failed.
And at the same time, his political commitment was just getting deeper. In 1935, reacting to the rise of fascism, he joins the Communist Party.
And this wasn't some kind of, intellectual tourism. This was boots-on-the-ground activism. His role was intense, propaganda, organizing among the indigenous Muslim population, the Arab and Berber speakers.
With the aim of building, what, an anti-colonial base?
Exactly, an anti-colonial pro-communist membership base. But he faced immediate obstacles, primarily because Marxist atheism was just fundamentally alienating to the deeply religious Muslim communities.
Still, that difficult work must have given him this invaluable direct insight.
It did. He witnessed firsthand the severe social, economic, and psychological problems faced by the indigenous population. They were marginalized and controlled by this relatively tiny French-Algerian minority, about 800,000 French settlers. This experience solidified his anti-colonial stance for life.
And that very commitment is what led to his political undoing, in a way.
It's true. By 1937, global politics were shifting. Moscow, fearing a weakened French defense against the growing threat of Nazi Germany, commanded a halt to any anti-colonial agitation in Algeria.
And Camus refused.
He refused to comply. He prioritized equality and justice for the Arabs over Soviet geopolitical strategy.
So he was expelled from the Communist Party. This event really foreshadows his later, more famous split with Sartre. Camus consistently put human decency and immediate justice above any kind of ideological utility or historical necessity.
After his expulsion, he found a platform in journalism, working as a reporter for the leftist newspaper Alger Republican. This gave him a venue to champion his cause. His reporting focused heavily on court proceedings,
Documenting cases against Arabs and Berbers.
meticulously. He showed how they were systematically subject to the harshest applications of the French-dominated justice system. He saw the law not as some universal truth, but as a tool of colonial oppression.
And it was during this period of intense political and emotional engagement that he really started writing fiction.
Yes, he started the unfinished novel La Mort Heureuse, The Happy Death, which has this similar figure to his later protagonist, a man named Patrice Mersal, who consciously tries to achieve a happy death.
So the raw material for L'Étranger was clearly being laid down, motivated by both political rage and this deeper existential inquiry.
The world then quickly caught up to Camus' sense of existential chaos. World War II breaks out, and in 1940, he flees Paris just ahead of the German advance.
And remarkably, this period of flight and national despair, it was his most creatively fertile. He completed his novel L'Étranger and his pivotal philosophical essay Le Mythe de Sisyphe, The Myth of Sisyphus.
The timing of their publication was, you could say, perfect for the French psyche. The Myth de Sisyphe was published in 1942, right in the middle of the occupation, and it resonated profoundly.
Because the essay basically gave people intellectual permission to accept tragedy and meaninglessness while insisting on, dutiful immediate commitment and action.
Exactly. For a nation that was occupied and struggling, facing this absurd, senseless conflict, this was philosophical fuel. It instantly catapulted Albert Camus into the front rank of European thought.
And he transitioned that intellectual resistance into physical action, becoming the editor-in-chief of the underground resistance paper Combat.
Right after 1944. And that work just cemented his image as a man of both principle and action. Post-war, he became one of the two most dominant French public intellectuals, often grouped with and pitted against Jean-Paul Sartre.
His political idealism continued to focus on humanitarian causes, rooted in a sort of moderately leftist pacifism. He was relentless in condemning French colonial cruelty, drawing on his earlier journalistic experiences.
And by the mid-50s, he was advocating for what he called bürgerrechtliche Gleichstellung.
Full civil rights equality for Arabs in Algeria.
Yes, but this position was complex, and ultimately it failed to satisfy either side. By 1956, many autochthonous Algerians rejected his vision because, fundamentally, he still hoped for a pluralistic French Algeria.
And they were demanding full independence.
They were. So Albert Camus, ever the anti-authoritarian, maintained his political allegiance toward anarcho-syndicalism, a total rejection of all centralized state power, whether it was French or Soviet.
He was always looking for a political system based on worker freedom and mutual aid.
Always.
Okay, let's turn now to the concepts that really made him famous. We have to start with the rejection. Albert Camus actively, and sometimes, aggressively, rejected the label of existentialist.
He did. He insisted that his seminal philosophical work, The Myth of Sisyphus, was written against the very tenets of the philosophers commonly called existentialists.
And this is such a crucial point that gets simplified and muddled all the time.
Yeah.
The existential divide, it centers on that core premise of existence in essence.
For Sartre, it was existence precedes essence. We're born blank, and we define ourselves through our choices. Camus disagreed with that fundamentally.
So how did he reframe that relationship?
Camus argued that essence and existence, as he put it, they walk and rise together in the same step. You can't isolate one from the other. So his philosophy is defined not by existential freedom, or by the confrontation with this central contradiction, the absurd.
So what is the absurd? Precisely. It's more than just saying life is meaningless, isn't it?
Oh, much more. It is the conflict itself. The absurd arises from the collision between two things. Man's, his justified, innate, and relentless search for meaning and purpose.
And the world's complete indifference.
And the world's permanent, indifferent silence. The world simply does not provide the answers we crave. He called it a divorce between man and life, the actor and his stage.
It's that moment the human mind demands logic, and the universe just replies with static.
That's it exactly. And the power of the absurd is how easily it's encountered in the daily grind. Albert Camus captured this perfectly by describing what he called the why moment.
Up, tram, 4 hours office or factory, eat, tram, 4 hours work, eat, sleep.
One day the question why arises, and with this weariness, everything begins.
That moment of profound fatigue, when the routine just stops justifying itself, that's the moment the absurd shows its face.
It's the sudden realization that the entire structure of civilized life, your career, the mortgage, all the social expectations, it's this massive effort built on a foundation of, well, zero ultimate purpose.
It stops being a structure for life and starts looking like a prison. And once the absurd is recognized, the immediate problem becomes mortality.
Yes. The fact that all our striving, all our consciousness, all our love, it just ends definitively. For Albert Camus, death is an absolute end. It has no inherent meaning, no transcendent purpose. It is the one unavoidable fatality that seals all our sensible and senseless deeds and revolts.
So if that conflict is unbearable, the knowledge of meaninglessness, coupled with our human need for meaning, the most immediate way out is to just eliminate one side of the equation. And this is where the idea of philosophical cowardice comes in.
Camus calls this the peril of escape, or the philosophical suicide. If you can't bear the tension of the absurd, you try to transcend it. But true resignation, or fleeing the conflict, is still an absurd act.
The existential leap.
The existential leap. It's the intellectual attempt to cross over the impossibility of finding meaning by simply postulating meaning itself. So you adopt a dogmatic, faith, religious, political, whatever, that resolves the contradiction and dismisses the world's silence.
So for Camus, to become a devout Christian or a committed Marxist or any kind of ideologue who claims to have the ultimate answer is actually an act of philosophical suicide.
Precisely. You've killed the questioning part of your soul. It's an act of intellectual bad faith. The authentic stance for the absurd man is to reject that leap entirely, to preserve the tension.
It means you have to constantly limit your expectations of meaning to just the immediate facts, the tangible present.
And this stance also addresses the question of physical suicide, which he also rejects. If you choose death, you are still trying to resolve the absurd, to end the conflict, which is the very thing the absurd man must strive to maintain and live within.
It sounds like it requires a massive amount of mental discipline to live without appeal, without the promise of a future reward or a transcendent explanation.
It's the heart of the dilemma he explored in his early drafts. We mentioned the novel La Mort Heureuse.
Right, where the protagonist, Patrice Mersal, ultimately achieves a consciously lived, happy death, believing he's returning to the truth of the immobile worlds.
It's an interesting early concept, but ultimately that resolution is too easy. The real philosophical challenge is to live with the absurdity, not just accept a final peaceful return to an immobile world. The mature Camus demands action within the conflict.
Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like if you enjoy this podcast.
So, since neither blind faith philosophical suicide nor self-destruction real suicide is an acceptable response, the solution is the third way, permanent revolt.
Okay, so the absurd is overcome, paradoxically, only by accepting the absurd situation itself and just refusing to compromise with the ultimate meaninglessness.
The human must be an actor, not a victim. We must strive forward despite the indifference of the cosmos.
But if there's no goal, what are we revolting against? And why is the revolt permanent?
We are revolting against the condition itself, against the demand that we live under the terms of meaninglessness. It's a refusal to submit, and it's permanent because the absurd is permanent.
So as long as the human demands meaning and the world denies it, that conflict is eternal.
Therefore, the commitment to consciousness and action must also be eternal.
And this is where the mythical illustration of Sisyphus becomes so powerful.
Sisyphus is the perfect tragic hero of the absurd, condemned eternally by the gods to push a massive boulder up a mountain, only to watch it roll back down every single time it reaches the peak. Albert Camus tells us that Sisyphus finds happiness and dignity in the very act of this endless, non-goal-oriented, rebellious striving.
And it's the journey back down the mountain that's crucial, isn't it?
Absolutely. When Sisyphus descends, he is aware, he is scornful, he is defiant. The gods condemned him to labor, but they did not condemn him to despair. In that brief moment of descent, he realizes that the rock, his fate, it belongs to him.
So the happiness isn't in reaching the top.
Never. It's in recognizing the futility of the task and choosing to push it again anyway. It's an eternal rising up with a scornful nevertheless, an endless process that defines his freedom.
And this realization of freedom within constraint is what marks the definitive break with Jean-Paul Sartre.
Precisely. Camus's permanent revolt is individual, it's existential, and it's non-goal-oriented. He's revolting against the human condition. Sartre, especially as he moved closer to communism, demanded a societal revolt aimed at a concrete historical goal.
The establishment of the communist state.
Yes. And the clash became vicious in the early 50s. Sartre essentially argued that Camus' revolt was a purely aesthetic exercise, detached from political reality. He said that by criticizing the horrors of Stalinism in The Rebel, Camus was betraying the historical necessity of the leftist movement.
And Camus countered that any revolution that sacrifices immediate human lives for some promised future utopia is fundamentally unjust.
And that it's an act of philosophical suicide itself. The new ideologues are just taking the leap into totalitarianism. For Albert Camus, no future goal, no matter how glorious, justifies political inhumanity or violence against the innocent. The commitment must always be to the present moment and to the refusal of tyranny.
But if that individual revolt is permanent, but also, fuel in the long run, it could become cold and nihilistic. Where does Camus find value to warm that endless struggle?
He finds it in others. Revolt alone is insufficient for meaning. The human needs what he called menschliche warme human warmth.
So while individual contemplation is necessary, being solitaire, it has to be complemented by relationships and shared experience, being solitaire.
Right. He saw human relationships as complex, absurd in their own way, but utterly necessary. They are two sides of the same coin. You have to maintain the tension between being solitary and being in solidarity.
You can't take the leap into total isolation or total subservience to a group.
Never. And his novel, The Plague, perfectly illustrates this. The struggle against the disease, which is itself a metaphor for all meaninglessness and arbitrary suffering, forces people into mutual support.
The protagonist, Dr. Rio, he commits himself to fighting the plague simply because someone has to, without any guarantee of success or meaning.
Exactly. And the journalist Rambert's journey is so key. He initially tries to escape the quarantined city to return to his lover, convinced that personal love is the only thing that matters.
But he eventually chooses to stay and fight.
He chooses to stay and fight the plague alongside the others. He realizes the fight is necessary not just for himself, but for his connection to the community. He has that ultimate insight. If he stops loving everything else, what's the point of fighting? The shared struggle gives the revolt its ethical core.
And this ethical core, this insistence on resisting inhumanity, it guided his political life toward anarcho-syndicalism.
Yes, because he found authoritarian states abhorrent, especially the ideological cruelty of Stalinism. Anarcho-syndicalism rejects all forms of hierarchical centralized power.
So he favored a system where the means of production were owned and controlled by the unions, the workers themselves.
Right. It's a political structure that emphasizes decentralized, immediate, and horizontal solidarity based on human need rather than abstract political goals.
It aligns perfectly with his philosophy. It stands above the historical party structure, focusing on individual dignity and worker freedom.
He advocated for a United States of the world, a global federation built on local solidarity, and for the abolition of wage labor, which he saw as a form of modern servitude. His political mandate was to resist all forms of political and existential inhumanity.
Justice now, over utopia later.
Always.
So we've diagnosed the absurd, we have the action plan of permanent revolt and solidarity, but how is that effort immortalized or justified?
Albert Camus assigns this ultimate strategy to art and the artist.
So art isn't just decoration, it's an act of defiance.
It is the highest form of revolt. Art, as he discusses in L'Homme Revolté, is the act where the artist creates the world anew on his own account. The real world is imperfect, irrational, and cruel. The artist takes that reality, selects it, reshapes it, and rebalances it, giving it a form and coherence that nature denies.
This brings us back to that striking statement he made in his diary.
Yes, he noted. The absurd world can only be justified aesthetically. Art provides a necessary distance from suffering. He called it the distance that time gives to suffering.
So when we view a tragedy in a poem or a painting, we're not denying the suffering, we're transforming it into something manageable.
Something that can be contemplated, something that allows us to persist. Art lets the absurd man live intensely, but with enough perspective not to be destroyed by the suffering.
And this commitment leads directly to his 1957 Nobel Prize message.
It does. When he received the award for his important literary production, which with clear-sighted earnestness illuminates the problems of the human conscience in our time, he stressed the inseparable link between art and freedom.
He argued that art is superior to ideology and politics.
Absolutely. He believed the artist must remain independent. Art should never be a hermetic pleasure reserved for the elite. It must be a tool to reach the greatest number of people by presenting an exemplary image of common suffering and joy.
If the artist surrenders their freedom to an ideology, they lose their power to resist oppression.
Exactly. The integrity of the artist is a cornerstone of the permanent revolt.
And now we come to the shocking test case for all of these ideas. The novel The Stranger and its protagonist, Mersault. This book isn't about philosophy, it's about watching a man live and then be tried, as if the absurd were real.
Mersault is the perfect absurd man, but he doesn't theorize about it, he just lives it. His narrative begins with that famous, emotionally flat opening, detailing his mother's death. Mama died today. Maybe yesterday, I don't know.
That language immediately establishes his profound lack of conventional effect. He treats the funeral arrangements not with grief, but with his clerical detachment. He's focused on logistics, the bus, the time off work.
And his behavior at the vigil, that's what seals his moral fate in the eyes of society. The focus is entirely on his physical needs overriding any emotion. He accepts coffee from the porter and smokes cigarettes at his mother's coffin.
When he's asked if he wants to see the body, he just says, "I don't know," and refuses. For us, the reader, this seems detached. For the jury later, it's proof he's a monster.
And the day right after the burial is maybe the most famous example of his detachment. It's Saturday. He wakes up, vaguely remembers the burial, but focuses on the sunny weather.
Goes swimming, meets Maria Cardona, they go to a lighthearted movie, and they sleep together.
This rapid transition from death to dating, from burial to beach, it completely defies society's required narrative of mourning. Later, he tries to explain to his lawyer that his physical exhaustion and the need for connection simply eclipsed any appropriate sense of grief.
But the justice system, which demands emotional logic and a performance of sorrow, it can't comprehend this physical, immediate, unreflective commitment to the present moment.
The key takeaway from this opening is that Mersault commits the moral murder of his mother long before he commits the physical murder of the Arab. His crime, in society's eyes, is the failure to grieve, the failure to perform humanity.
The path to the physical murder is equally absurd and passive. He gets tangled up with his neighbor, Raymond Sintis.
A man the sources describe euphemistically as a warehouse manager, but who is widely known to be a pimp. And Raymond wants to punish his Moorish mistress for infidelity.
And Mersault, with his total lack of moral conviction, just casually agrees to help Raymond write this cruel letter to lure the mistress back.
It's a passive acceptance of malice, and this leads to the confrontation on the beach. During the outing, Raymond and Mersault encounter the mistress's brother, known simply as the Arab, and his companion. A fight breaks out, Raymond gets stabbed.
And later, Mersault walks back alone to the area, carrying Raymond's revolver, compelled not by revenge, but by the oppressive heat and discomfort.
The famous moment of the crime arrives, and Mersault's motive is pure absurdity. He claims the sun was the cause, the indifferent natural force that overwhelms his consciousness. He felt the immense heat pounded in his temples.
And he describes the Arab stepping forward and the intense glare of the sun reflecting off the knife, which he saw as a glittering sword.
He fires the first shot, and this first shot, he claims, was an involuntary reaction to the physical discomfort and the overwhelming light, destroying the equilibrium of the day.
But then, and this is the critical philosophical move, he doesn't stop. He waits, and then he fires 4 more shots on a lifeless body, into which the bullets penetrated without being seen.
That is the moment of conscious decision. That seals his fate. The first shot was an accident dictated by heat. The next 4 are his act of revolt. By doubling down on this senseless act, he's not seeking a resolution. He's confirming the indifference of the world and his own alienation from traditional morality.
It's the ultimate commitment to the immediate physical fact of the moment, confirming that the distinction between life and death is unessential.
And the trials where society officially tries to put the absurd man back into a comprehensible framework. It's an ideological confrontation.
The prosecution cares so little about proving premeditation for the murder. They're prosecuting his lack of soul. It's a moral indictment.
The entire case hinges on the testimony about his behavior at the funeral. The staff from the home detail his calmness, his smoking, his drinking coffee.
Celeste, the restaurant owner, tries to help, calling the murder a unglück, a misfortune, saying you're powerless against it, and Mersault is a good man.
But the prosecution is masterful at flipping moral convention. When the defense argues that the porter offered the coffee, the prosecutor spins it. An innocent man would have refused coffee at his mother's vigil, showing appropriate self-denial and grief.
His inability to perform that required social ritual is proof of his moral depravity.
Maria is then forced to detail their immediate post-burial sexual and recreational relationship. The prosecutor emphasizes the cinema trip, a comedy, to solidify his image as a debauched animal incapable of human feeling.
The trial becomes a psychological and moral autopsy.
And then the prosecution dramatically links the 2 events. He argues, the same man who indulged in the most common debauchery the day after his mother's death, killed for trivial reasons.
They assert he's guilty of the murder of the father killer, the parasite case that's up next, arguing that killing one's mother morally announces and legitimizes the later murder.
And Mersault is completely alienated. His only self-defense, that the son was to blame, is met with laughter in the courtroom, because the court only deals in rational motives, not environmental ones.
To make it worse, his own lawyer starts referring to him as I, erasing Mersault's agency, turning him into an object under judicial scrutiny.
He is sentenced not for murder, but for being a stranger to humanity.
In prison, awaiting execution, he faces his final confrontation, the pressure to repent and embrace God.
And he repeatedly refuses to see the priest, stating calmly that he does not believe in God and finds the whole question unimportant.
This refusal drives the judge, who represents society's need for transcendent meaning, into a frenzy. The judge holds up a silver crucifix and screams that all men believe, demanding, "Do you want my life to have no meaning?"
It's the judge who's having the existential crisis. He realizes his own meaning depends on Mersault's repentance and adherence to the system.
And when Mersault is asked if he regrets the crime, he can only say he feels a certain boredom, not genuine remorse. He can't conjure the emotion the system requires.
His final contemplation of death is pure Camusian philosophy. He thinks about the guillotine, recognizing its cold, efficient precision. It stands on level ground, eliminating the romanticized, theatrical ascent to the scaffold. The machine is stripped of all moral significance.
He realizes the flaw in the machine is its very efficiency. It gives the condemned no chance for survival. Yet ultimately, he accepts his fate, realizing that dying now or in 20 years is unessential.
In the very last moments, Mersault has this explosive confrontation with the priest, losing his temper and screaming about the sheer absurdity of the universe and the arrogance of the priest's belief. This explosion clears his mind.
He finally accepts the tender indifference of the world and finds a strange kind of happiness in knowing his life, brief and meaningless as it was lived authentically without illusion.
His final wish, that there be a crowd of spectators at his execution crying out in hatred, is his final act of solidarity, connecting his singular, absurd experience to the vast, indifferent existence of humanity.
Albert Camus continued to push his philosophical agenda, even as his fame grew. His essay, L'Homme Révolté, The Man in Revolt, from 1951 marks the moment that philosophical friendship with Sartre just shattered beyond repair.
The book was an analysis of revolution throughout history, and it argued that while revolt is necessary and noble, the individual rejecting the absurd historical revolution tends toward totalitarianism and tyranny. It was a searing critique of Soviet-style communism and Stalinism.
Which Sartre, deeply committed to Marxism, saw as intellectual treachery. He accused Camus of being a moralist, detached from the necessary historical struggle, effectively charging him with portraying leftist ideals.
And the break was definitive and public. It ended the dialogue between the two most prominent intellectual voices of the age.
Camus' later literary output continued to explore the complexity of human morality. La Chute, or The Fall, in 1956, is a sharp indictment of self-deception and the hypocritical nature of human relationships.
A huge contrast to Mirasalt's naive honesty. And then he followed that with L'exil, Le Royaume, Exile, and the Kingdom, a collection of powerful short stories, many returning to the landscape and moral dilemmas of French Algeria.
In 1957, Albert Camus was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. He was one of the youngest recipients in history at the time.
And the committee cited his work, which, with clear-sighted earnestness, illuminates the problems of the human conscience in our time. He used the platform, as we noted, to stress the primary role of the artist as an advocate for truth and freedom against all forms of oppression.
Tragically, his life, one so dedicated to confronting death and living consciously, was cut short in a way that was just utterly random and absurd. He died in a car accident on January 4, 1960.
He was a passenger in a car driven by his friend, Marcel Gallimard, his publisher's nephew. The car skidded violently due to a flat tire, hit a tree, and Albert Camus was killed instantly.
The irony. A philosopher obsessed with human control over fate dying in a purely accidental manner is just stark.
At the time of his death, he was working on an autobiographical fragment, Le Premier Homme, or The First Man, which was published posthumously in 1994. The manuscript was rediscovered after the crash. It was a return to his roots, trying to understand the poverty of his childhood and the legacy of the father he never knew.
A search for the origins of his own moral compass.
Finally, just as a note on the historical record, our sources do mention the existence of some speculation regarding the nature of his death. A Czech poet's diary entries suggested the vehicle may have been subject to, well, external interference.
Specifically KGB manipulation.
Possibly ordered by former Soviet Foreign Minister Dmitry Shepilo in retribution for Camus's virulent anti-Stalinist rhetoric. We report this neutrally, just noting that such speculation exists and has resurfaced recently.
A dramatic, sudden, ultimately absurd end for a life dedicated to resisting indifference.
So let's quickly distill Albert Camus's central statements for you, the key takeaway from this deep dive. First, Camus defined life as fundamentally absurd, not meaningless, but defined by the eternal conflict between our relentless human search for meaning and the world's indifferent silence. This conflict must be maintained, not resolved.
Right.
Second, his authentic solution was not despair or the philosophical suicide of ideological faith, but permanent revolt, accepting the absurd situation while constantly striving forward with awareness. It's a necessary, endless process, perfectly illustrated by Sisyphus's scornful descent.
And
Third, this revolt finds its ethical grounding in solidare, in human warmth and solidarity. It must be directed against political and existential inhumanity, with art serving as the highest form of defiance and the aesthetic justification for living in a chaotic world.
And linking this back to Mirasalт.
Yeah.
The true crime he committed in The Stranger wasn't the murder of the Arab, which was absurd, but the prior failure of emotion, the moral murder of his mother through that profound inhuman indifference.
That indifference was the ultimate offense against the human connection that Albert Camus championed as the only possible fleeting value in an absurd world.
So a final provocative thought for you to carry forward. If Albert Camus insists that the only true justification for the absurd world is aesthetic, that is, committed and consciously lived, then the art of living itself becomes our highest moral and rebellious obligation. What does living aesthetically with awareness, passion, and solidarity look like in your routine every day when that question of why starts to creep in? If the world is silent, what is your personal permeant revolt?